tako, da moraš govoriti, mislim, moraš, ampak, a veš, tako se mi zdi, da, ne vem, rabi eno posebno pozornost, tako da malo čutiš skupino, pa to, pa je bilo itak je pa zraven narobe, veš, pa je...
Which is not an individualism at all, let's face it. It's a mass slavery, nothing else.
Si v redu, drugače?
Ja, gled počas.
Wow.
Se vračaš počas?
Great, we have the final already.
Boljše ta počasni ritem.
Ja, da kar miselno.
To je to. Tako ste pa lepo poletje imeli v hiši?
Let me just take care of muting my technology because I typically...
Ja, ne, se
forget.
Ja, v redu. Mislim, tako družinsko, na en mesec sem imela, da si bil 8.
Kako to viš, da je še premala, ne?
Smo shajala.
Nonetheless, it's great that there is this heated debate.
Yeah, at least.
Posterity at least. Just to know that there was some people that were not agreeing with this.
Yes, and it's multi-generational. Many older women. So it's really good. And many young people. So it's good. But when you see 5,000 or 10,000 anti-vaxxers 2 days ago, which are in Ireland, which lived a lot, and with children, and with many young women. Yeah. Really good. And of course, what government does is equidistance itself and saying you are all the same, you are left-wing fascists. That's in your...
Yes, I love that.
Oh, I love that.
You could write million treaties.
Long live
But it is really Orwellian.
It's completely,
pro-life movement.
Absolutely.
Anyone else?
Ne, jaz bi, če kdo bi že nekaj radimo.
Draga publika, lepo pozdravljena na današnjem dogodku o razmerju med nepokorščino in umetnostjo v okviru zaključne konference projekta RESHAPE v Stari mestni elektrarni in na spletu. Dogodek bo potekal v angleščini. Hello people, welcome to the 4th day of the two-folded conference Reshaping the Art World, an experiment in collaborative change-making happening in Zagreb and Ljubljana. It's our 2nd day here in Ljubljana, and I'm happy to greet people from all over the world in the audience here and in the audience via streaming. My name is Teja Reba. I'm a cultural worker, feminist activist and artist, and I will be your obedient host this afternoon, talking to 4 amazing disobedients: Svetlana Slapšak, Valeria Graziano, Tjaša Poreber, and Amanda Pina. We'll talk about an evergreen today, the troubled and troubling relationship between disobedience and art. We have 1 hour and a half approximately, and I'll invite the 4 speakers to contribute firstly with their presentations. After each presentation, we'll open the floor for 1 question from the public, and then later on, after the talks, we'll be opening the floor for your comments and a wider discussion. So please take notes if you won't be able to ask your question related to the talks during the session. Svetlana Slapšak, anthropologist and doctor of ancient studies, a writer, translator, editor, professor, researcher, dean, and activist. Throughout her life, Svetlana Slapšak stood up to regimes and ideologies, persistently defending her humanist thought, something that was especially important also but not only during the period of war in the Balkans. After facing dangers and legal troubles for her work advocating human rights, peace in her native Serbia, she moved to Slovenia in 1991 and continued her activist work here, including organizing the women's anti-war group Silence Kills, Let's Speak Up for Peace. She has since served at many international universities, including the Ljubljana Graduate Schools of Humanities, Rutgers University in New Jersey, and the EHESS in Paris, as well as continuing her literary careers with essays, novels, and contributions to newspaper and magazine. She published a great amount of books and was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for the initiative 1000 Women for Peace. Svetlana, we're all yours.
With being old. I was inspired very much recently to think about disobedience after the visit of the great Italian philosopher Umberto Galimberti in Ljubljana, during which he gave an interview to the weekly Mladina and said openly that Antigone should have been buried alive, because she proposed the bloodline to participate in legislation and not only the citizenship as the main element. This is a very rude and brutal thing to say, but not the first. Bernard-Henri Lévy, the French right-wing philosopher, made a combination with Antigone's guilt some 30 years ago, then Slavoj Žižek some 5 years ago, claiming that he was the first. And now we have this old philosopher claiming the same. Why, for heaven's sake, why being so brutal in regard of the fact that Antigone did not have the citizenship being a woman? But let's face it from only the artist's point of view, and that is Sophocles' view of his work and his public. And his public were all the citizens of Athens, that's it, males, which did not have only the liberty but also the duty to sit in the theater, which was one of the institutions of Athenian democracy, and to look what the artists have to say about the life of democracy. The theater was bringing four facts and data and situations which were not available in courts or in the agora or in the parliament, which was open to everybody, but especially focused on love, family, religion, history, the relation between people, so the other side of things. And so citizens had the opportunity to learn, to debate, and to translate what they have learned in the other institutions of democracy. That was the ancient theater. It was not culture. It was in bed in democracy. So in this situation, Sophocles putting his tragedy in Thebes, which was not a democracy, which was rather close, some 70 kilometers, but of course, to Athenians, a much lower standard of ruling and much lower standard of life. So Athenians could see this situation in another city, which is worse than them, and learn from the play what the problem of democracy basically is. The problem of Antigone is not only herself and her disobedience to the order of the day of her uncle, but it was also the problem of Haimon, her fiancé, who commits suicide along with her. When he sees her dead, he commits suicide. And this is happening on the scene before the eyes of Creont, the uncle, the ruler, who had this command daily pronounced, and one of them was that the bodies of the fallen against the city should not be buried, which was really important for Greeks everywhere. So why Haimon does kill himself? And the only answer is because he cannot help the situation in which Antigone is. It's not the love suicide. It's not Romeo and Juliet. It's, should I say, deeper? He commits suicide because she cannot propose a law, which is a citizen's duty and possibility in democracy. Everybody is capable, everybody should be capable and openly allowed to propose a new law. She was willing to propose a new law, and that is about burying everybody and giving everybody the possibility to pass on the other side in a decent, regulated way, ritual way. So this proposal could not be pronounced anywhere. There was no place in which she could propose that law, and she was not allowed to propose the law because she was a woman, she was not a citizen. So he kills himself because he sees the problem with the ruling system in his city. It's not only love, it's not only despair, it's also the protest, the final act of disobedience. To deprive the ruler, crowned, of his bloodline. So it's not the bloodline that is a problem. He deconstructs the bloodline and the whole legislation system of the tyranny and proposes the other way, and this is the way in which everybody should be able to propose a law. That is what Sophocles says to his co-citizens. Women should participate in politics. There was another author whose main theme in everything he wrote, well, he wrote much more than it is preserved, that is Aristophanes and his comedies. He proposed in all of his comedies, there's an element of disobedience, which is the leading motive of all of his comedies. The oldest one we know is about the guy who is a citizen, being a male, and he's overvoted in favor of the war with Sparta. So he decides to make his own peace with everybody in the domain of his own household and his backyard. And he sells peace in small bottles to everybody that wants to buy it at a certain price. So there's a comedy running around, not the democracy itself, but the fact and the illusion we still have today that the majority is the most important is in democracy. It's not. Majority is just an instrument which serves to arrange things in parliamentary democracy during the elections. Why? Well, there is a collective memory, and this collective memory is in fact preserved in the rules on the election days. You are not supposed to drink, and you are not supposed to bring weapons with you. So this is an extra day when emotions are running high. So that's majority. After that, democracy deals with minorities and the individual. And the right of individual to oppose the majority is the legal one. So that's one thing. And then there's a series of comedies in which women take over the power in different ways. One is with sexual strike. The other is with masking themselves as men and taking the parliament, and so on and so on, making men voting to give power to women. That's a very specific form of revolution, and so on and so on. So there are 11 comedies, and in all of these 11 comedies, it's disobedience, which is the main motive. And usually the majority of these comedies is about women taking power and showing how disobedience should be practiced by women to change the democracy. And now the question, why these two artists and also the other artists, the other writers of comedies and tragedies, and also actors, and also everybody that was in the theater engaged, citizens were engaged, and they considered an honor to participate in the theater, to play on the scene, and so on and so on. So what was the main demand in all these works which we today consider classic without really deeply reading them? The main thing is that democracy cannot function without disobedience. It cannot function without being against. It cannot function without innovations. Democracy renovates itself. Well, I'm speaking about direct democracy, the Athenian democracy, but it should be introduced on certain levels, even in our really rotten parliamentary democracies. Without disobedience, there's no progress. So disobedience is not just allowed in a liberal society, no.
It is necessary to innovate democracy on a daily basis. That's the only sense of democracy, to be changed, to be challenged, to be asked, to be questioned, to be focused on negative parts, to be, to be punished if necessary. But basic thing is to be disobedient. To be disobedient also because disobedience calls for education. And education probably against disobedience or running free with disobedience together is probably the only way to solve a great problem that we have today, even in Slovenia, and this is the problem of resistance to vaccination. So yes, disobedience, but then learning. So this is the complex that we usually do not understand, because never the direct democracy was applied in such a way that it was in the Athenian polis, although it was the city of men and not a city of women. In this situation, thinking about artists being faced with problems of today's world, one of the solutions is, again, perhaps the disobedience could be this grain which will help grow another local universal democracy that we all dream of. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. Taking one question from the audience, if someone wants to react. Okay.
There was an O, I heard. So, yes, I will answer that question. No, I don't believe it completely.
Okay, I do have a question then. If we think of civil disobedience or even artistic disobedience generally undertaken to achieve a worthy public goal, right? We have recently witnessed much disobedience in pursuit of anti-democratic, anti-liberal, and refusals to abide to anti-discrimination or violations of certain rights. So reproductive services and etc. So how do we evaluate, the range of those reactionary, let's call it, or conservative social movements which manifest in the civil society, in the public sphere, and their relation to other forms of disobedience?
Well, the very effective first step, and this is not only my historical memory, but my experience in the last year and a half or more, and that is a comedy. The performative aspect of demonstrations in manifestations in Ljubljana was really very innovative, and it helped a lot to understand things immediately. Comedy helps to understand things immediately, to put the things where they are at the moment in which they are produced. So the artistic production during the demonstrations, the Friday demonstrations in Ljubljana, was very rich. I'd love someone to take it as a PhD topic or something like that, and to analyze all the phenomena, all the facets of this really interesting process, how visually, performatively this comedy, which was responding to the effects, was performed. Well, one of them was that the guy with the mask of the minister who was responsible for the horrible law on waters, and this was solved in a referendum, but one of the event was the guy with the mask of this minister jumped into Ljubljanica, which was a dangerous thing, and that time of the year and the hate and everything, but the professional did it. So yes, comedy demands a lot, but it really says exactly what we want to see, so, and what we have to learn. So yes, comedy is the first step.
Okay, thank you. We are moving to you. So Valeria Graziano will share some insights on Disobedient Cultural Institution from a historical perspective. And she's a theorist, an activist, an organizer. Her work focuses on cultural and technical practices that foster the refusal of work in its interconnected dimensions, redistribution of social reproduction, and the politicization of pleasure. Over the years, she has been involved in numerous actions, research initiative across the cultural sector and social movement. She is one of the conveners of Pirate Care, a translocal project that focuses on collective learning and disobedient responses to the current care crisis. She's also a research fellow at the Center of Post-Digital Cultures at the Coventry University. You can find her contribution to the RESHAPE publication. I think you can get one at the entrance. Yeah. The contribution together with Tomislav Medak and Marcel Mars called Politicizing Piracy, Making an Unconditional Demand. Valeria.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Thea. Thank you, Svetlana. Yeah, what to say? I think I will go historical, not that historical, but a bit more recent, but it's a good lineup, I think. Yes, I very much agree that maybe one of the good reasons to revisit this trope, which is a classic, as you were saying, disobedience, it is because we are faced with somehow a right-wing claiming of like an array of methods, including aesthetics of disobedience, and that calls for serious consideration. But I'll take a bit of a detour because your invitation kind of got me thinking around if it's useful at all, but how do you define a disobedient practice now? Because after 2.5 years, almost 3, of Pirate Care, which was a project that kind of mapped and worked with a number of activist practices that consider piracy in its caring dimension, really dealing with a lot of aspects of social reproduction and care. So trying to reclaim maybe disobedience from this dimension of the machoist, interventionist, demonstrative gesture of politics, a very different key. But it becomes super clear that the diversity is immense, what we mean by disobedience. And what I ended up thinking, for me, that's where I'm at, I would love to hear feedback, but is that disobedience is always some kind of relation of triangulation, so especially the civil disobedience that we're interested in here, right? Because, and it's a commitment to persist and carry on a practice in the hope of producing the possibility for another type of change to happen, right? And in that sense, I think this kind of is a regime of byproduction. You do something, you want to do something else. You persist and try to open a possibility of a different law or a different regime change. So in that sense, it's slightly different, I think, from how right-wing is posing the problem, because disobedience that wants to be, and again, I like the good term here, because I'm aware we need to decolonize the way we think things, but I'm gonna say progressive politics, leftist politics, ex-politics, I'm happy for you to fill that gap, but is that there is to be a care for a societal arrangement, not a communal. And I know we are in the age of communities everywhere, but a community is often based on similarity and homogeneity, whereas trying to disobey in the name of the possibility of a proliferation of de-identification and uncommonality is a different game altogether. And I think that's where I'm at with this thinking. But to give some traction to this kind of speculative provisional proposal, I wanted to just share 2 fragments perhaps of research that I've been preoccupied with in the last years. And I'm not sure if I know about art and disobedience per se, I should confess, but perhaps I have some thoughts to share around cultural institutions and disobedience. And I think we are facing a crisis there, at least in my corner of the world, that needs new coordinates to reorient what is that cultural institutions are trying to do, fringe or not fringe. And I think I would start to narrate this shift that starts to happen in the late 90s, because this is when we see a parallel rise of relational aesthetics on the one hand, that brings within museums, festivals, biennale, a whole array of practices that are social, political, engaged, participatory, and so forth. But also this idea that art institutions can become key sites of public speaking, of production of critical knowledge, of sharing of that critical knowledge, right? So we see an explosion of what is usually called public programming, right? So it's not the exhibition, it's not the theater as such, but these parallel events that are much more discursive, they're workshop-based, seminar-based. And what's interesting is that excavating a bit of the history of public programming and its explosion, it maps very neatly with this reconfiguration of art institutions, also from a managerial perspective and a funding perspective, in a much more neoliberal key. So we have, on the one hand, this kind of celebration that finally museums are becoming more democratic, more accessible, more diverse, and they foreground values of democracy and participation and dissent and disobedience. Yet, on the other hand, this coincides with the explosion of post-Fordist labor, precarization, immaterialization of value production chains, and so forth. And I think this leaves us with a very difficult to treat heritage if we are committed to an art of disobedience today, because why? Because the way in which the institutions often curate and stage these critical dialogues somehow, as a byproduct, does not open more spaces for democracy and disobedience. And so it's a very interesting, weird loop effect, because when you end up staging disobedience as an end in itself, there's something that is being created. And not to name anyone, but in 2002, in Documenta 11, Okwi and Enwezor, God, I can never pronounce his name, people will forgive me anyway, was among the first curators, internationally renowned practitioners at least, that starts to advocate for the need of having these discursive platforms, right? And he actually called the series of events that preceded Documenta platforms, and they all had thematic focuses, including decolonization and critical theory, with important speakers such as Stuart Hall, Zizek, who will be happy he's been mentioned twice in the same panel, Chantal Mouffe. Anyhow, and again, we have a dual, disobedience is always situated. So while that kind of gesture opened up so much for initiatives that followed, it is important to remember that it also kind of produced a global stage for a specific kind of public intellectual figure that is somehow specific to the 2000s. It's somehow unprecedented. And today, much of the public programming that at least I see around try to, in that way, kind of reflect political urgencies of the moment, and yet the discourses they produce are mostly disconnected from the places where these emergencies could produce disobedience, locally, in situated organizing, in organizing that sustains itself after the event, through pedagogy, through public assemblies, and through acts of disobedience, right? I'm worried about events that are designed to feel political, but they don't produce political consequences. There's somebody, Professor Art, Mick Wilson, that used even stronger words for this. He calls the mechanism by which liberal white middle class practitioners are enabled to function as the global dispossessed. Make of that what you wish. But I think it is a ghost that sits with the way in which the cultural field is producing or reproducing itself, right? And yeah, and platforms that produce discourse within the cultural sector often do so invoking some kind of neutrality. The idea is that the cultural center, the museum, the biennial, they allow for a space of appearance of all kinds of critical groups to be heard and to be seen and to access publicness as this classical idea of space of appearance, like Arendt, following the Greeks, introduces. And yet I think that we need to contest this neutrality because it's just not working anymore in the moment in which we have our extreme right-wing and revanchist conservative claim to the same spaces. Neutrality begins to become the mechanisms through which you undo the demos by democratic mechanism. So it becomes an empty shell of a platform, as in we give equal space or equal share, equal visibility to any claim, and it doesn't have within it mechanisms that allow for a self-defense of the democratic body. The production of critical content that does not reflect the conditions in which cultural organizations work themselves, and this is another problem, more to do with management and funding and the setup. I would claim that it's not just a missed opportunity to in itself, but I think it risks to further neutralize this political and disobedient potential of the very topics, right? So it's not just a neutral, nothing happened, but by having no consequences, we are de facto furthering and furthering the gap in between what we're talking about in terms of content and the forms of life that we persist in leading collectively. I mean, there's no moralism in here, mind you. I'm absolutely implicated for more than 20 years in all of this, but still I think it's important to look at where we're at. And this is also true. This problem of the platform is an interesting name. I've been doing some thinking with a couple of friends, Joanna Graham, Susan Kelly, hi. There is something around the platform that even in the name, names the pedagogy. A platform is something that raises up and disconnects, right, from the, yeah, it's a perfect thing for petrol extraction, a platform, but, and this supposed neutrality of the platform that can host everyone equally because they're disconnected and uninterested and not getting messy and dirty, actually mimics platforms online, which are the places where a lot of these events have their afterlife. Because let's face it, even now we're in stream, but there is an afterlife for live gatherings nowadays, and we cannot continue to pretend that there is. An event is just no longer an event. It's an event and it comes with many ghosts, and these ghosts are facilitated by digital platforms that have their own owners and their own logics of capital redistribution of attention and so forth. Yeah, so just in conclusion, and I won't go much into this, but where can we look for alternatives remains an open question. I can offer maybe one concluding remark that is from a very, very provincial place, which is called Europe, and not very important, but that's where I'm based, so unfortunately this is my bias, and there we do have a model of cultural institutions that I think is worthwhile revisiting for some inspiration, if nothing else. And this is one that has been called the People's Houses, and maybe they've been called in many ways, but more or less is a translation in most European languages. And this is an interesting story I came across, because basically what I've been trained to think was that cultural sector as such is pretty much appearing in Europe after the Second World War, where a bunch of states set up for the first time ministries of culture, and that becomes part of like an active citizenship in the modern sense, at least. And so you have this idea of the state, democratic Republican state and cultural sector completely like married from the start, and that is simply not the case. Insofar as people's houses were places that actually wanted to produce culture, and the first ones came around 1870s in Russia and Belgium, Spain, Portugal, France, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, UK, Sweden, and Italy has a very big tradition of people's houses. And it's, again, not a simple task to define them because they have quite different arrangements, but pretty much they were places, you can imagine, like where local worker organizations would basically group all of their associations. Most of them were collectively owned, either bought or built, which is very interesting because you have histories where people are paying in and bringing bricks that they would steal at work to build a people house. And this was solving also a problem because in the socialist, international work and socialist movement, many times they did not get easy rental to have meetings because most rooms you could rent were either owned by the church or the conservative party, so they would have to meet in fields or on boats on rivers. So they needed a place. And there were interesting experiments in self-management of the working classes in relation to cultural and educational production. And there's a few characteristics that I particularly find disobedient in an interesting way. First of all is that they would produce cultural events, but not separated from struggles. So you had literally in the same building your union meetings, your party meetings, and then also not just that, so not just struggles, but also social reproduction. For instance, mutual aid societies, so taking care of your sick, and buying cooperatives, so they would buy in bulk and redistribute for cheaper prices, so you would take care of the shopping, basically, for cheaper. And the other aspect is that they really tried to take care of culture, education, and recreation, which is, we can call it different ways today, leisure time, like, you know, they had bars and restaurants and the billiard and whatever. And you go there and you have a beer with your mates and you discuss the day, right? And you recoup from alienating work. But alongside that, you find an exhibition, and alongside that, you have a theater program, and alongside that, you have classes, evening classes of various kinds, and a speakers program, which is funny because apparently the workers were often complaining that the speakers were too idealistic, and they wanted to indoctrinate them into some brand of Marxism or other, and they're just like, nah, we don't want that. Just talk about interesting stuff to us. But anyway, this is for another story. But I think it's just to give a kind of a little trajectory of a minor genealogy that there were successful attempts to practice culture alongside different premises that we can look at, and I think they prefigure something that might be important to keep in mind as we navigate, disobedient today and try to see what is disobedient really. Okay, thanks. I hope I put more.
Thank you so much for this, Valeria. Indeed, we do have also a local version of this in cooperative homes, zadružni domovi, that were established after the war and in the 50s, looking for other ways of how to practice culture. We'll come back probably to those questions unless there's a question. Yes.
Thank you. I had a question on Google and read it. But Valeria, I have a question for you. When I heard you speaking, the word that came to my mind was co-option. But I wasn't sure if you were really speaking of co-option of disobedience by the cultural institutions or co-option of the cultural institutions by the hegemonic power.
What do you think? Because that's your term.
Both.
Right. Yeah, I think, what do I think? I think to put it this way, it's useful confronted to maybe specific instances as a generalization, yes, it's probably true in various ways. I guess in different conjunctures, there's different rooms for maneuver and subjects, to blame if you need to. But in a way, I find it more interesting to depersonalize and actually look at systemic pressures, because I know there's a lot of really like, how you say, sound and ethically sound practitioners that find themselves co-opted. So I suppose the proposal here is to examine what is systemically available to us to invent, and to, in a bricolage way, building solidarities, and in that direction, I suppose. Yeah, co-option is always there, hunting. Thanks.
Tjasa. Tjasa Poreber, a long-term activist for social justice. She's a political scientist, an independent researcher, specialized for cultural policies and social movements, journalist, publicist, and much more. She was head of advocacy of Asociacija, a network of self-employed artists and NGOs in Slovenia, and she now works as the head of communication in Glej Theatre, Ljubljana. Tjasa, you will be somehow continuing and localizing maybe the topic within our context. Thank you.
Yes, you know that wonderful moment for every moderator when, after about half an hour of a great debate and thought, someone says, we need to really question the basic concept of this discussion. Well, I guess that's going to be me today.
That's good, that's good.
In my defense, I did warn Teja about it. And in my second defense, I will also try to kind of propose or make a proposition what I think would be a more helpful concept to what I think we are all collectively trying to think of, how to not obey and yet not to speak about disobedience. But why do I have problems with the concept of civil disobedience? I mean, I am not a linguist, I'm not an expert in linguistics, and I will not try to pretend to be, but I was thinking a lot about the concept of the word civil disobedience in English and državljanska nepokorščina in Slovenian, which is supposed to be a translation of the concept, and yet it, in my opinion, actually very much diversified, because in Slovenian, državljanska nepokorščina actually means citizenship disobedience. So it sort of suggests that only the citizens, those who hold citizenship, who are part of the community of a particular state, can actually be the ones who, as Svetlana said, help to improve democracy by being disobedient and questioning it. And I find it that in an era of mass global migration, where so many people are robbed of their basic rights that come to them through the citizenship, it is actually very problematic for any kind of progressives to actually claim civil disobedience in Slovenian language anyway, to be a concept that describes their direct action that questions basic elements of state oppression. And I also think that it is not a coincidence that Slovenian right-wing intelligentsia, I would say, who is very proud of the sort of, but also, I should add, the liberal part of the Slovenian intelligentsia, often thinks about the civil disobedience as something very positive, something that in the 80s in Slovenia, as part of a sort of social movement, actually contributed to the formation of the new state and the transition from socialism to capitalism. I think that a country that is based on administrative genocide of the erased, of an act of actually stripping all the citizenship and all the rights that comes to it, to a huge amount of people from former republics of Yugoslavia, which is what Slovenia did in the beginning of the 90s, to several tens of thousands of people here, to then again claim the citizenship as the basis of who is allowed to be disobedient is actually not such a coincidence. Why am I saying this? Because it was exactly the group of erased that as activist group of people without any papers who were risking much more than any of us risks when we go to the street and make a creative or any kind of other political action, actually used a lot of artistic methodology of, let's say, artivism, of creative action in the streets to actually connect all the people who were stripped of their citizenship and form a social movement that was fighting to correct social and historical injustice, for which, by the way, up to this date, no one actually stood any kind of trial or political responsibility in Slovenia. And they were using some very, like I said, creative expressions of what I think many of us would probably in some other context call artivist practice or maybe even civil disobedience. So this is why instead of civil disobedience, I prefer the term direct action. I think that direct action as such is something that better describes an attempt to address any kind of social injustice. And that direct action can either be some kind of creative direct action, or it can be going much more on the path of challenging some of the things that state and capital is taking for granted and protecting it with a lot of brutal power. And by that, I think that I am coming closer to the basic concept that I think differentiate disobedience from direct action, and that is the question of violence. I don't think it is a coincidence that in the description of this talk, the quotation from Rawls, a prominent liberal thinker, was used to describe civil disobedience, if my memory serves correctly, as, and there was a lot of things, but one thing that I think is important in this context is as a non-violent act. And I think that when it comes to violence, this is always a question of power relation. Who defines what is violent and what is not violent is usually people who actually have the power, who are suggesting that those people that are robbed of any kind of power to participate on equal basis in the society, who are marginalized, who are pushed to and beyond the margins of society and are using whichever expression they actually can to make their issues more visible, that they are violent. Whereas those who can be part of, let's say, sort of community of the accepted can use the non-violent methodology that, of course, helps to improve the already existing order. Because I think that civil disobedience, in that sense, when it actually contributes to the remaining and continuation of the status quo, whereas direct action actually challenges the status quo as such and opens up a window of possibility to actually reshape, no pun intended, the future of the society as such. To be more precise, what I mean about the question of who defines what is violent and is not, I would actually like to show you a couple of examples of the art that was. Sorry, let me just figure out how I can. No, this will work, I think. Yeah. Because I would like, on some concrete examples, actually show you what it means and who defines violence. So this is a picture of a graffiti that was written on the floor in front of the Museum of Contemporary History in Slovenia. It says sramota, which in Slovenian or in English means shame. It was written in 2020 at the end of the year, and it was the same slogan was actually used and written in one night in front of several, if not all, cultural institutions that were targeted by the far-right government that is currently in power in Slovenia, and they either changed the constitutions of these institutions in order to sack the existing directors or change them, and of course by that also highly influence the direction of artistic programming, but also of, let's say, history building. Sorry, let me just check the time. Okay, I still have a couple of minutes, I think. So why is this particular case interesting? Is because, of course, the far-right elected government reacted in a expected fashion. Of course, they pronounced this action to be an act of vandalism, an act of violence, even though, of course, obviously nothing was destroyed. The graffiti wasn't even put on the building, it was put on the floor everywhere. But nevertheless, they reacted predictably. But what is more interesting is that it wasn't the far-right government that actually started a criminal charge against the anonymous artist activist who did this act. It was actually the director of, now former director of this museum, who called the police and started criminal charge, even though you could say that this action was actually done in solidarity with her, because she was also being on the way out by the far-right government. So I think that sometimes the really daring direct actions produce this sort of effect, where they actually show that if we are talking about too much of the culturalization of a protest action, we can have a problem, because it is usually on the concept of private property or its destruction, as innocent as it might be, that you can see where the people are really honestly in the project of a radical change, or just nominally in the project of presenting subversive thoughts that do not sort of follow with the practice. Another interesting example of that sort is this action in front of the Ministry of Culture. The street was changed into a sort of office with names of the different of the minister, of the different uradniki, of different administrators from the ministry. On one side, and on the other side of their names, it was written what they are actually destroying, like film sector, different artistic sectors, and so on. And because of the red blood, red paint, which was supposed to symbolize, I suppose, or at least that was one of the lines of interpretation. It was supposed to symbolize the blood of the artists under the far-right regime. On the other hand, the Ministry of Culture actually interpreted it as a death threat, and there were criminal charges started against some of the people they thought did this, and were since dropped by the judicial system. But nevertheless, they were supposed to go on trial for death charges, for death threats to the elected officials, which can of course result in many, many years of prison. Again, this action divided also the liberal public, because many people thought it was no longer a place of civil disobedience, of nonviolent action. They believed that it went too far, and that it that it had a counterproductive effect, where the art world was no longer non-dangerous actor that is kind of cute and nice to talk to or look at, and their actions are in that similar fashion, but was seen as too radical. As women, we often hear, of course, that for a lot of feminist actions as well, that I'm not going to go into deeper analysis of, but of course, many times, especially feminist actions are considered not polite enough, too rough, that they went too far, and so on and so forth. So this is a very common discourse of people on power, and I think that when it comes to power, of course, it never comes only from one space of, let's say, an actual governmental institution, but it often is also a question of unequal power distribution amongst ourselves, even amongst art community, and I think that any kind of civil disobedience, or as I prefer, direct action within the art community actually has to challenge those relations of power as well. And I think that the best way to challenge them is actually through a practice that that challenge us all to actually rethink where we are and how far are we actually willing to go when it comes to fighting for a different, more just world. I will finish this because I think that I'm taking a lot of time, and I would like to, yeah. But if I can just say just one more example, because I think this is important to what you were actually opening, and I think it's also a question for all of us who work in the art world important, and that is a question of recuperation. And why I think the question of recuperation is an important one, because oftentimes direct action is something that is much more common for activist world than it is for artist world. And oftentimes we see how tactics that are primarily used by activists on the streets are then somehow incorporated into art world without the necessary, not just critical distance, but I would say without the necessary sensibility on where they are, in which context they are being used or reused. And I would just very shortly describe this exhibition, which is called Social Dress by a local artist, Maria Mojca Pungarčar, in 2013, after probably the biggest self-organized mobilization that overthrew the current prime minister in Slovenia. She made, with unemployed women, she made a workshop in those of you who were on my tour of Rog and other factories. There was a small there is still a small laboratory that is supposed to be the creative hub for the future creative center Rog. Anyway, this project was made there, and it took slogans of anti-capitalist protesters that, like I said, participated in this uprising, and put them on different items that are somehow connected with household elements, like as you can see here. And what happened was that on one time, in the anonymous activist stormed the gallery where this was exhibited and took all the items. Because it was seen as something that was actually recuperating activist slogans, activist risk, and everything that people did on the streets, and sort of like turning it into an art project without the necessary sensibility, and then again done through some kind of structures of both patriarchy and of course gentrification. So of course that is still considered to be, I think, the biggest art theft in Slovenia, and nobody actually wanted to see it as an artistic intervention, which is something that was or almost no one wanted to see it that way. There were some. It is seen as pure vandalism. And I will end here because I think that it maybe opens up a good place for a further discussion. But I would be very happy to also continue if you encourage me in that direction.
There's a question here. Yeah.
So, if the word in front of the Museum of Contemporary History was not shame, And if it did not, if it didn't support directly or indirectly the director, should she have called the police, or should someone else have called the police, or should nobody call the police?
In my opinion, I mean, I think that relying on the same kind of force when you, that the social elites are relying to protect their access to capital and power in order to persecute those who probably do not have the same kind of channels that many of us have of public speaking or access to media or whatever, or public space, is actually probably not the best model trying to create a more coherent and society that can actually have a conversation about where it wants to be and what is wrong in it. So in my opinion, it would be better not to actually call the police in whichever case such intervention comes, because I don't think that we can put ourselves in such patronizing position that we would claim that the only form of resistance is actually the kind that is close to us. I mean, maybe we don't agree with everything that happens. Maybe we don't agree with methodology of how things happen. And I think that this kind of disagreement is completely logical, and even it makes sense, because I also don't agree with a lot of things that happen in this society. But I think that we have to be generous enough to understand that we are not the only claimers of what is right and what is wrong, and what is the kind of methodology of resistance that is actually acceptable. Maybe something that is completely acceptable today, actually when it first happened, it never was. And if we look at the history of, let's say, feminist struggle, like we will see that the thing that the suffragettes did, for instance, like it was a huge scandal when they did it, and today it probably wouldn't even be noticed and stuff like that. So I think that this normalization, this is probably not the best word, but I think that we have to, if we really want to give a chance for society to change, then I think that we have to be a little bit generous with things that we don't understand, and rather than defining very clearly what kind of tactics should be used for resistance, rather think about diversity of tactics that are possible, so that not only the specialist in activism can find their space, but rather that this becomes a very wide and accessible mode of resistance where everyone can find their own form of expression. I'm not sure if I answered, but yeah.
Thank you. There was another hand raised, but we'll take that afterwards, okay? So we'll move on. I also wanted to comment on some things, but maybe, yeah.
Can I go shortly?
Okay.
If you want, I mean, if you want to continue.
No, but I think maybe it's if you can. I mean, if you
totally.
need to go urgently, then.
I am the person with a cough, which is like in COVID times, like a very difficult thing to deal. So I was planning to go and cough there, okay. Which is because when you cough nowadays, it's like very suspicious. But sometimes your body just coughs. You know, we were discussing that, and I think there is something about traveling in the air. I have my PCR, I have my thing, but I'm in the coughing mode.
Okay, you can cough. I think we're all fine with coughing, right?
I think you already realized.
We're on the safe side anyway. So this is Amanda Pina. Thanks for introducing yourself. Chilean-Mexican artist living in Vienna and Mexico City. Her work is concerned with decolonization of art, focusing on the political and social power of movement, temporarily dismantling ideological separation between contemporary and traditional, human and animal, nature and culture. Next to presenting her work in major institutions around the world, she's also a research fellow at the Department of Theatre, Dance and Performance at Amsterdam University of the Arts. So I'll just, you can dive directly into it.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you for being here. Thanks for the water of this mountainous region, which is very, very delicious. And thanks for the land in which we stand, which allow us to be here, and for the air that we are breathing that is not too polluted, so that we can not only cough. I think I will complicate the things much more, and I'm hesitant about that. I understand the situation in which we are in Europe, so I have to think from a local perspective and from this kind of locality, right? Which is like the nothingness approaching, like in a children's movie from the 90s. So we are losing spaces and places, and we are kind of being surrounded by a right-wing populist ideology. This is very clear. At the same time, my work deals with the what we call decolonial method and decolonial practices, which have to do with acknowledging the fact that modernity is also coloniality, and coloniality is also modernity, and there is no modernity without coloniality. And that if one acknowledges that fact and start to look at in which ways a form of thought that emerge locally from a provincial place expands through the world and produce a monoculture of thought which reproduce itself and which somehow traverse everyone, also the people at the other side of the colonial difference, people like me who, you know, are Mexican and Chilean. In a way, when we take that line of thought and we start to look what coloniality is and in which way modernity and coloniality are the same, and in which way nobody here, even if we would like, can live an ethical life because we are part of the conditions of capital and extraction of, you know, from bodies of people, earth, animals, plants, minerals, etc. And we look at how that works and in which way that monoculture of thought expands in the world. We look at the university, the theater, the museum are part of the pedagogy of modernity, coloniality/coloniality. They are part of that, of the expansion of that language. They are exports of that. They reproduce that in the former colonial places. And the contemporary is not an exception, and it operates in certain ways. It operates within the frame of, you know, what we can pauschalisieren, like pauschalize, like put into brackets of what we can call Western culture, which is, I think that's a very, I don't like to use it, you know, because I know that in the way that thought emerges and becomes very, very powerful is, of course, intertwined with its own conquest of spaces and places in Europe in order to expand. But when we think about the way that modernity/coloniality, because we like to call it like this, because we don't think that that coloniality is the collateral damage of a beautiful civilizatory project called modernity, which, you know, and that actually the problems in the world are due to the lack of modernization, that they will be solved when that happens. If we look at that seriously and how it operates by denying present, access to present, to others. And that others, happen to be, you know, under the conditions of coloniality or under the conditions of economic extractivism. I grew up in Chile, which is an extractivist place. I have been just very, very recently in Belgrade and sort of in kind of feeling what it means, like, to have extractivism really close, you know, with the whole issue of Rio Tinto. I don't know if you're aware, but of a lot of mining corporations that are coming in the space, because there, it seems to be probably lithium there, which is a problem. And but extractivist countries which have been on that side of coloniality, especially, for example, like Chile, which is a big example, right? In a way, Chile as an example of neoliberal politics, like an experiment that doesn't happen. You don't convince the population for that to happen. You force it. It only happens. I mean, nobody will say, yes, I have my social rights, I give it to you, and this you understand very well also what that means locally. But just to make the story short, I am very concerned with epistemic disobedience, because that form of thought, which is reproduced and exported through institutions like the university, the theater, and the museum, among others, like the school, have produced a situation in which we are finding ourselves, which is the crisis of that civilizatory model, the undeniable crisis of that form of thought. And that form of thought operates with certain building bricks. No? There is a saying in African studies and decolonial studies from the African diaspora, which is, you cannot dismantle the house of the master with the same tools of the master, something like that. So you cannot propose an alternative to that construction of reality, which is a world-making practice that generates the destruction of Earth and the extraction of the life of others, and it's based on the consumption of the life of others, those others being human and non-human, with the same structures of thought, with the same building bricks. So epistemic disobedience, I think it has to do with forms of knowing, and this is, I am very concerned with that in my artistic work, forms of knowing which are not or have not been invited at the table, but on the contrary, have been disempowered, neglected, oppressed, vanished, erased. So for us, Western modern colonial thought is a form of thought that produces. It reproduces by creating absence, by creating the non-existence of other forms that could contest that form. And that form of thought, or that form of sort of colonial thought, is expanded also through practices of reproduction which somehow exclude others from the present moment, from a certain temporality. So the traditional, the indigenous, right? And forms of knowledge which are understood as less valuable. And in a way, that process is somehow managed through the classes in power, and with some kind of a police, which is the scientific method as the only validator of experience and truth. So with that, having said that, and I know that we are here in Central Europe, and we are in a context that might or might not understand what it means to be at the other side of the colonial line, what we call the abyssal line. I like to engage in practices of rehearsing an ecology of forms of knowing. And since I come from performance, dance practices, which are practices that are based on the body, which have to do with knowledge that is not orally transmitted, not written, but directly somehow stored in experience and through experience, I work with indigenous forms of knowing in frames that I can think of as forms of rehearsing an ecology of forms of knowing. And I think that in a way is related to disobedience, even though I think the conversation was going much more in the front line of what political action could mean. I think it's very important that those things go hand in hand. And I think that if we are going to continue thinking concepts like nature in the way that we have thought of them till now, which lead us to the destruction of Earth, it would be very sort of naive to think that any action would transform the very fabric of the way those relations are in place. So I am very inspired by relational ontologies and by other forms of thinking relations, other forms of thinking the human, other forms of thinking the earth. And I am very suspicious about certain, words that we use on a daily basis, like natural resource, nature, H2O, when talking about the very things that sustain us as communities, as people, as living ecosystems, because science have come to the point to understand us as holobionts ourselves, like as beings that include many, many, many beings. And from my perspective in relation to direct action and the role of art, if I think of art as part of the pedagogy of modernity, historically part of that pedagogy, which is the pedagogy that is the place of the non-place, of the abstraction of the place. The museum is white, but we don't see that it's white, but the walls are white. Why are they white? And in which way things appear there? And are they located or not? It's like museum, theater somehow have been this very interesting and not only, but also residual machines of uprooting the experience of people in order to propose a form of thinking as universal when it is not. And this is a concern I have very much, because when I speak, I also, when we speak here, I am always with my different peoples, I carry them with me. I carry with them the Mapuche, I carry them with them the Yagan, I carry the Quechua, I carry the Aymara-speaking people, and I carry also the Nahua-speaking people of Central America. And when I think about their ways of making, their ways of world making, I find very suspicious that the time is ripe today to listen to what they have to say, and that I can be sitting at this table and invited to say something about, the Art of Disobedience for a mainly white audience in Slovenia. I find very suspicious that the time is ripe for that in front of this crisis of this civilizatory model. Is it because of that the time is ripe for us? Is it because the things are really broken, and the system is completely, so that we can listen to other forms of making sense, other forms of knowing, maybe not by distance and classification, but by relation and identification, right? Like embodied forms of knowing. And I work with people whose whose library is a sacred place in the land, and whose land is a chronosomatopos, so a place which has a head, a certain place, and kilometers to another direction has some genitals, and they have originated from there, and they have, they every year do walks into this place head, which is a library, to get in contact with the book of knowledge, which is a cactus. So I'm very, very interested in forms of epistemic disobedience and how can we generate ecologies of forms of knowing. And that's what I try to do with my art. And I would like to end with a side note. I didn't show you because my computer crashed, but I want to end with a side note about disobedience and art. And disobedience and social movements, right? I envision that arts in the near future, because I think this is like a portal, this moment, like a moment of change, also with the idea of climate change, increasing temperature, climatic disbalance, the right wings, the social movement, the big migrations that have been till now small, right, in comparison with what is coming. This time of portal, I envision that the arts of the future are not going to be anymore uprooted, and that they are not going to be anymore isolated. Because if we look at the theater, the museum, they replicate the laboratory as a form of knowing through distance and isolation. Scientific method, we remember it was developed by men in England at the same time that women were lying down in order to be, attended by male obstetricians for the first time. Women are being burned, and the scientific method is being created at the same time that the expansion of capital through, the beginning of the colonial endeavor allows the real more intense mining of the earth. And the earth till that point has been considered in Europe a nourishing mother. So in order to go a step front and be able to mine the earth, this method has to be invented. I don't say science is not a form of knowing. Of course it is. It's very, very practical to know things through distance and through isolation. But it depends for what? What do you want to make? So the ecology of forms of knowing works like this, that it considers that the sort of the potency or the value of a certain form of knowing exists not anymore in relation to its degree of institutionalization, but in relation to the practical contribution to a given task. And in the case of the Chilean uprisings, to burn everything and destroy everything and lose many eyes is a practical contribution to a given task, which is the possibility of writing a new constitution. So that was a very sort of dancey leap, but I hope you see what I mean.
Thank you. Thanks. I believe that those topics will be further explored also tomorrow. There's a roundtable entitled "Certain Things Need to Be Said If One is to Avoid Falsifying the Problem, Decolonization, Degrowth and Art." Sorry, it's quite a long title. With question on, like how are decolonization and degrowth mutually intertwined, how they are intertwined with the art world, etc. So I'm inviting you to join, if you're interested, the table tomorrow here, or join via streaming. It's at 5 o'clock. That's just to wrap up this part. And now we're like just on time now. But let's open up the discussion and, have maybe also a round of a talk inside the table itself if you want to, like comment each other contributions. Thanks.
Sorry for the audience. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah, use the mic so also the streamers can hear it.
Hi, my name is Renske. I'm from Amsterdam, representing Dutch culture, but I'm also part of DES graduate school, so that's very interesting to see you. Maybe during the whole talks, well, thank you all so much for all of your contributions. I was just wondering about one of the things Svetlana said, that comedy is the most direct way of helping people understand something. And throughout the whole evening, I got a bit more, maybe depressed of mind, still optimistic at heart. But I thought about different acts of disobedience. We saw the Ministry of Culture, one that also touched me a lot. And I kept thinking about comedy and maybe if that still has a place today, or how do you still look at that? Maybe I would like to ask Svetlana, because you've had so many years of experience, it would be wonderful to hear from you this answer. Yeah.
Thank you for this question. I would really like to relate it to what was heard recently. And there's one thing that we should consider, and that is connect comedy to vandalism. Because comedy can allow itself a lot more than any other performing action. Spoof, parody, just goofing, commedia dell'arte, whichever genre existing on historical you take, you can say more than in other genre or in other forms of literature and forms of performativity. And that is why comedy is so important. And the other thing is, let's think about something that could be the act of vandalism and the comedy at the same time. And I will recall a very famous study by Eva Coyles, which is called Reign of Phallus, in which she tries to prove that a certain event in Athens in the 5th century, in fact, was women's secret action to warn men about making war with Sparta. And this is one night in Athens, all hermai, and hermai are stone pieces which can have a face of the god Hermes, or his head, or the whole body. But whatever they had, however minimal they were, they always had one element which was kind of protruding, and that was a phallus. So one morning in Athens, all the hermai were chopped off. And Eva Coels is trying to prove that this was done by women who wanted to warn citizens, male citizens, about something very important, which is like war and peace. This is an act of vandalism, no doubt, and it's a comedy at the same time, because everything pertaining to sexual organs is funny. It makes us laugh, which is a cultivated reaction to death. So reaction to that by laughing is something that is extremely important. So any of these actions which were presented here cannot be at the same time vandalism and comedy. They're both. They're both. So yes, comedy and vandalism come together, and they should be, let's say, not styled, but they should be transferred into certain cultural context. And also they could be extremely effective when we come to decolonization and other conflicts that were brought for this evening. And I really loved the last intervention, because it really opened up things. And I must say, it doesn't have to do with comedy very much, but it's really important to say, when I was speaking the term classical, I spoke it with lots of effort, because I hate it from the bottom of my heart. And when I was to decide, at the moment of deciding what I would do as a trained, someone trained in ancient studies, I was going to really go mad. But then I had luck to go to Greece, to live there through the uprising against the colonels, to live really in the middle of that. And I found my solution. That was modern Greece, which is a culture which is colonized, deeply colonized, terribly colonized, violently colonized. And the relation between the two, which does not have any genetic line, on the contrary, meeting past and meeting present in the same territory was a revelation for me. So yes, then much later I found the school which fits my interest in this way, and this is the French School of Anthropology of Ancient Worlds, which does differ from anthropology because it has only dead witnesses. So there's a whole thing about making dead people to speak. And in this sense, the decolonization is the crucial part of this school. You cannot think otherwise than in decolonizing terms. And there's no privilege given to ancient Greece, on the contrary. Well, I would just add one thing, and this is if you watch today the European politics in education, there's no doubt that ancient studies are really marginalized and colonized. So I feel good with it in a way. But just turning back to comedy. The comedy is the first thing you react with if you want to live. If you don't want to live, if you're depressed, you don't react that way. But if you want to live, you laugh. So that's why I put it in the first place.
For the streamers, there's another question that's arriving.
Hi, my name is Ljubljana. I'm here with the Goethe Institute in Ljubljana. My question comes from being a mixed race woman. Something I struggle to understand is, as a minority in many aspects, personally as an individual, how can I, or people like me, let's just say, be disobedient in the society, but still be heard? Like, I'm trying to understand how it is seemingly impossible to get my voice heard. Like, I have a voice. It's basically, I'm kind of going on what Valeria said on platforms. There's no platform I can go to. There's no platform I can create because it seems like they are already being destroyed before I even have the chance to get there. So I would like to know your view on that.
May I?
Yeah.
I understand when you say mixed race. At the same time, race is a Western colonial invention. Mm-hmm. It means endogamia. So you are not, you have nothing to do with race, in the sense that you are, the outcome of difference. And you are not this and not that, but not something in between, but a third thing. Something that is this and that, and which creates some new context, no? Which is your experience. I can really feel you, as that is also my experience. And I think that when we are that, we can have a lot of perspective. And that is a very great value. And we need to make our own platforms and create our own contexts. But there's a lot of people that have done that before us. So later, if you want, I can give you some literature or something like that. Thank you.
Can I add something? Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think I might have failed miserably. I don't think I explained what I was trying to convey with platform. I think it's a very specific use. So unfortunately, I think any different voice has a platform insofar as it produces money for someone in certain respects. So the problem of voice for me goes hand in hand with the problem of messages. So the messages that do not disturb this kind of liberal idea of multiculti aesthetics are usually fine. And there is a lot of celebrity culture online to do with youth aesthetics, music, fashion, so forth and so on, that embraces that in such a nauseating way. So I would, I just want to reiterate, that's the kind of idea that for me we need to think of platforms as these highways through which certain kinds of messages and communications and aesthetics are circulating in the spirit of a facet of globalization. So I do hope whatever happens that you're not looking for your own platforms, but some other institution that is not conveying in the very name this idea of detachment, but actually are rooting and replenishing and detoxifying. That's the background of kind of linking platform, which is, is such a common word, right? You hear it, it's such a part of the lingo of neutrality. So that was what I was hoping to convey, but I think there's a lot of barriers of being in the rooms where decisions are made. That's a different conversation, and I hear you. I hope I hear that as a very urgent political problem. It's on us.
May I? Because when you say, like, I hope you don't make your own, there is only the possibility to make your own when the institutions, that art institutions, are mainly white. And this is the case of many places in Central Europe. And not only in Central Europe, but in colonial context too, like in Chile, in Mexico, white in the sense that they reproduce white aesthetic, like Western modern colonial forms of aesthetics, and that they reproduce that lexicon that I'm talking about, which is And this is a much sort of longer topic, but in which way that is structured, and what is aesthetics, you know, what is the history of aesthetics, and in which way they reproduce certain building bricks of what we are talking about, which is this modern colonial forms of episteme, ontology. We can call it many names. So I think to make your own platforms means to associate not with the ones that are the same like you, probably not, because it's difficult to be the same like somebody who is from 3 places and carries 3 different experiences. And probably it's also an issue in the moment that your body carry borders, you know, because there are bodies that carry borders and bodies that don't, or that do it much less. So I think it's important to create our own context. Very, very important.
I totally agree, but just not platform.
I don't know platform like.
Right.
Okay, we'll have that. You'll have that discussion, or we can have later. There is one more question, and then we have to close it up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question comes from the proposal of Tiaza, and what you proposed by thinking of disobedience as direct action, or replacing disobedience by direct action, made me think that disobedience is for me not just necessarily an action, but also not acting can be a form of disobedience, no, or refusing to act or refusing to obey to an whatever. So, but and I would just be interested if we can and just that's an open question to all of you. Maybe stay a bit, let's say, in this negative part of disobedience, negative in the sense of the not doing. And for me, it's also connected, perhaps, if I understand you correctly, Valeria, to what Valeria was proposing when she was talking about the byproduct, or the fact that when we do something, sometimes what we are actually doing, and we, I mean, we as individuals, as artists, cultural workers, but also we as institutions, when we do something, sometimes what we are actually doing is something else. And also that I have the feeling that sometimes at this moment, actions that can be unstoppable and that can be that can have important consequences are sometimes small or actions that in a way are not necessarily so loud. So I'm mentioning this just as a way to give some words to what I'm calling the negative, and of course I mean that in a positive sense, but the negative in the sense of the not affirmative part of disobedience, but more the non-doing somehow, or the doing something which is maybe not necessarily direct. And I don't mean to say that direct actions are not important, on the very contrary, but just to also invite you, if you want, to reflect a bit more on disobedience as non-doing, perhaps. Thank you.
Do you want to start? I absolutely agree with you. When I was speaking about diversity of tactics, this is exactly what I was talking about, that there can be so many different forms if we are willing to see them. And I think that sabotage by sabotaging the workflow, that can either be by refusing to work or refusing to participate in any kind of structures of oppression, is actually a very important form of subverting the existing order. So at that point, I can only agree with you. I would add also, like inspired by a previous question, where I don't want to go in I don't want to put myself in a position of telling anyone what they should do or not do, but I do think that the question of privilege when it comes to civil disobedience is actually something that we really need to discuss, because, you know, and I briefly touched this with the question of erased here in Slovenia. Like, when you are white, men preferably, and have a citizenship, you can do a lot of things that a lot of people who are not in that position can simply not do, because the risks for them is so much higher. And so then the question for me, as someone who is white, who is privileged, obviously is, what can I do not to be a bystander? Because I do believe that in certain situations, it is my duty sort of to speak, to take even more risk that some other people cannot, but at the same time, you know, as a white person, to continue to fill the space that actually should be given to those who are robbed of their voices in this dominantly white society. that again brings another sort of problems with it. So I think that I do not have a final answer to that. Rather than thinking about some of the things that I've learned from some very interesting groups that I met in United States of America, who are living in indigenous, how do you say, reservations, thank you, and who were speaking in times of when Mike Brown was killed and in Ferguson, and a young black man. The only reason why we know his name is, of course, because there were so many nights of rioting that followed, as an expression of anger that followed his murder by the police. Anyway, they said that far more than looking for allies, they are actually looking for accomplices. And I thought that that was a very interesting concept when it comes to positioning yourself when you are in a position of privilege to have access, to be able to be disobedient, and trying to open as much space and give as much space for the voices of those who do not have your privilege to be heard. That's just...
Maybe two things. I don't know if they are answers. One thing is not doing. It's very effective when it comes to not paying. For example, as an idea, like the riots in Chile started by secondary students and primary students who refused to pay the subway because it was racing again. I don't know. I like this idea of not doing, but it's totally political not to pay something. And in relation to what you are saying, I like to quote Gloria Anzaldúa when she says, the only legitimate inhabitants of the borderlands are the whites and those who align themselves as white. And I like to think that if you happen to be white and you don't align yourself, it's not about chromatism. Of course, there are privileges that come with, the construction of race and what it appears to be and what appears to be majority in Central Europe or in different contexts, which actually is minority, maybe, I don't know. But this idea of aligning or not aligning and complicity and, it's a very, very interesting topic. But of course, we mention whiteness always in relation to, when we are talking about decoloniality, but whiteness is a discussion that I think white people have to do, right? To talk about what it means, whiteness, and how do they perceive it. And it's such interesting conversation, I think, that has to somehow go hand in hand with trying to think in a perspective that is not anymore ruled by those systems of thought which are oppressive.
Thank you very much, panelists, and thank you so much, audience and public. Hope to see you tomorrow and have a very, very nice evening. Thank you.